Is Africa the next big labor market to exploit for cheap labor? I know China's got a lot of dealings in Africa, but it's so disjointed and
Well, I mean, first of all, China
Africa.
does not have many dealings in Africa. They have some
Well,
infrastructure that they've built.
yeah, and
Uh,
they're doing a lot of loans there, is my
well, whenever you
understanding.
see the Chinese spending $12 billion on something that's only worth $3 or $4 billion, that's not investment. That's
Oh,
capital flight. That's some bureaucrat taking advantage of that hyper financialized system to get some out. So when it's his time to run for the door, he already has a nest egg.
oh, that's
Uh,
interesting because the impression I got was they were trying to act like a World Bank, where they're
Oh, they're splashing around a lot of cash. I
right.
agree. I'm just
Yeah.
saying that it's not in anything that would broadly be considered sound investment.
Okay.
Most of the infrastructure is not in places that are really of any use. I mean, if the Chinese build infrastructure in a place that hasn't had infrastructure for the last
Mhm.
70 years, you really got to ask yourself why there has not been infrastructure there for the last
So
70
someone
years.
would have done it by now, in other
Exactly.
words. Yeah. Okay.
Now they are investing in some resource production zones, absolutely, but again, they're overpaying for them.
Hmm.
So the Chinese are doing no refining and they're doing no manufacturing in Africa. So they're actually not taking the African labor force and bringing it up a notch at all. And
Hmm.
if they want unskilled labor, they've got that closer to home in a place like, say, Cambodia. So for Africa to kind of move up the ladder, they've got to be part of someone else's supply chain. They don't have the indigenous capacity, technology, and capital necessary to do it all by themselves. And in a world that's moving into a tighter labor market, if you're not going to relocate the labor, you're talking about using some degree of automation to help out.
Yeah.
Some places can do that, some places can't. But it's difficult for me to see kind of a neo-colonial manufacturing system set up to tap unskilled labor on a different continent, especially a continent that has as riven geographically as Africa. So the basic transport issues are
Yeah.
very, very difficult. It would be cheaper to do more automation in a closer economy. So in the case of Germany, that's probably going to be Poland. In the case of the United States, that's probably going to be Mexico and Colombia. In the case of China, that would probably be Southeast Asia.
That's actually, I was going to ask you about automation a moment ago. There's certainly a lot of fear that automation is going to take a lot of jobs away, especially in transportation, which is really one of the biggest industries in the world when you count all the taxis, trucks, and everything, the tankers with, self-driving tankers and cargo ships and everything else, right? Peter, I'm sure you've laughed at this stat too, but according to the BLS, the only actual job category that was ever lost to automation is elevator operator. So,
And
it
technically, that wasn't automated. We just do it ourselves now.
yeah, right. It's DIY. You push your own button nowadays. But are we at a point where automation now is different than it's been in the past? Because it always ultimately created more jobs in the past, and there's no
It is different and probably not in the way that most people are thinking. I'm not
tell us.
overly concerned about automation being a giant job destroyer.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, the Zoomers are the ones who are coming in, the smallest generation we've ever had, and they're not millennials. They're not social. They're antisocial, and
Mm-hmm.
they're very loyal workers. They're very nervous people because they were raised by Gen X to be told that the future was a dark place where you will have no power, because that's what it has been for us to this point.
Yeah. Okay.
And because of that, they're very loyal workers. Once they get a job, they cling on to it like their life depends upon it. But they're antisocial. They want to work remotely, preferably in a closet, preferably coding. These are not line jobs.
Uh-huh.
These are not public service jobs. This is a very specific subset. So, if you're in San Diego and, or I'm sorry, in San Jose and you need a bunch of coders, great. Your workforce is covered for the next 20 years. You need them for anything else? Yikes. So we are going to need automation, not just because we have fewer workers, but because the workforce of those fewer workers is very, very different from what we have had for the last 40 years. So we have to
Mm-hmm.
have it. On the flip side, automation is one of the most expensive things you can do. It's expensive to develop, to operationalize, to install, and people always forget about this step, the most expensive of all, to keep it updated. That takes capital. We're
Yeah.
not going to have as much of that. So this wrestling over what little bits of capital are left is going to be huge.
Okay, so in other words, you're saying that will slow automation.
I would expect it to, yes.
Yeah.
The places that can do it successfully or most successfully are going to be those places that do have a stronger capital base, like the United States.
Yeah.
I would also add in that in a world that deglobalizes, The idea of having a supply chain with 1,000 steps is kind of silly and honestly really dangerous.
Yeah.
So you need shorter supply chains closer to the end consumer.
I think COVID made us all realize that. Yeah.
Absolutely. I agree, but
Yeah.
compared to what COVID has done, what's coming is a whole nother level in terms of intensity.
Tell us about that. Well, when you're finished, but
sure. So manufacturing, especially for things like electronics, it does best, it's most efficient when it can tap different wage levels and skill levels. So you do the low skilled stuff in one place and the high skilled stuff in one place. And for the last 25 years, that has made China very successful. They do the assembly, they do the low end, and they do it at scale. So they can then have the intermediate and the higher end parts elsewhere in East Asia or maybe even in North America. And there's a lot of back and forth, and the average manufactured product crosses a border at least 100 times. Even in automotive in the United States, if you're taking each individual piece, you're talking like 25,000, maybe 30,000 border crossings. It's massive.
Oh my gosh.
In the world we're moving to, that's going to be harder to do. But the United States has Mexico. So we've got 130 million Mexicans, 35 million Northern Mexicans very proximate to the border, and we can still play in that old style manufacturing. At the same time, we have the best capital structure to bits and pieces moving into the new style. And the consumer base is right here, both in the United States and Mexico. So having that everything proximate and co-located, that's going to be kind of the big mix of factors that generate outsized success. You're not going to have that in Asia, because the consumption base is gone and the labor structure is now too expensive. And if you break down maritime transport safety, those border crossings are more difficult because in the United States, it's a land border with a country we broadly trust. In East Asia, almost all of it is by sea, and the Chinese are making a point of being a bag of dicks at sea. So the very concept that you can have a maritime trading system in a country where China is either rising or falling is a bit of a reach.
So bad for China again.
Very.